I am so excited to have on the podcast this week Dean Beadle. Now, I know lots of you throughout Australia and New Zealand have seen Dean and myself present back pre-COVID. Dean hasn't been out to Australia and New Zealand since COVID, but I always find his information so helpful. If you don't follow Dean on Facebook, he is someone who's going to give you amazing insights of his lived experience. Dean shares on there his singing. You'll hear him talk about it in the podcast. He shares on there a lot of his insights, like with his OCD, if you have any children with OCD. And he shares about his beautiful relationship with Chris, who has travelled out to Australia and New Zealand with him. And he also gives me a really positive outlook and lots of good ideas to try and implement. Now, if you are a teacher assistant, many of you might have done Dean's course, which is fabulous, and make sure that you check it out. It's a 2-hour teacher assistant course, and if you're listening to this live, it's going to be on sale. So make sure you check your emails for information on that. But what I was going to say with the Dean Beadle course, although we made it for teacher assistants, because Dean's teacher assistant was fundamental in his education, we made that course for teacher assistants. I've had many teachers do the course and love it too, because Dean really talks about so many great things that can be put in place to support our young people. And he also talks about a lot of myths and confusions and misunderstandings, which I think are invaluable too. Like that, what if the child becomes too attached to their teacher assistant? Well, Dean can reassure you that he isn't too attached to his teacher assistant that I think he had for 4 years. In fact, he bumps into her down the street. That's it. It's not like he's had an ongoing codependency on her. So I like the fact Dean actually shares from his lived experience. But in this podcast, he's really going to share the importance of him having a strong identity, autistic identity, and how that has helped him. And I'm sure you're going to get some great insights from Dean and really think about how you can apply this in your classroom and home. Oh, I forgot to say, there is a fabulous PDF to go with this podcast episode where I've put in the 10 top tips from Dean, things that he talks about, but also other things I've learned from Dean over the years about doing a swan act, about if teachers gave him a 10-minute break, they'd get an extra 50 minutes work, how it was important for him to know where the finish was. So many of the strategies you've probably heard from me, but hearing them from Dean in a lived experience. So make sure you download the PDF to go with this podcast episode, but also my learnings from Dean over the years. Again, if you check on my Facebook page, you'll see there will be a link there. Or if you get your emails, check your emails for my top tips from Dean that I've taken away both from this and my learnings from Dean over the years. Welcome, everybody. I am thrilled today to have Dean Beadle on the podcast with me. Dean Beadle has toured the UK and internationally for 15 years as an autistic speaker and trainer. He speaks at conferences, events, university courses, and seminars about being autistic. I've had the privilege of having spoken with Dean in Australia and New Zealand, which is lots of fun, and we have so many fabulous memories of our road trips. We might get into some of those later, Dean. Maybe a few spider stories. Or maybe that's a whole podcast on its own. It might be an X-rated one. But anyway, welcome, Dean.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's so nice to see you.
It is so lovely. Now, Dean, one of Dean's absolute talents is he's a singer, and he frequently sings at charity balls, and I highly recommend you watch some of his fabulous singing on his Facebook page. They always lift my spirits, and lots of fabulous 80s songs. Just saying, 80s is the best decade of songs, Dean. Just saying.
Oh, absolutely. It's the last time music had a tune. There's
true.
No two ways about it.
Even my kids still listen to 80s. So it's amazing. They're the ones they're happy to listen to, even though they weren't alive then. So do you have a favourite people should start with? Which is your favourite on your Facebook?
Oh, that's an ask. Well, actually, my favourite is one I haven't quite done yet, but I'll tell you about that later.
Oh, okay. So keep sign up to Dean's Facebook page so you will be the first to see this coming soon. It sounds good. Dean is a proud promoter of the autistic voice, encouraging and empowering other autistic people to share their experiences and insight too, which is our topic for today, autistic identity. Dean, can you share what that means to you?
I think for me, and I can only talk about my own experience, I don't claim to be a voice for anybody else except myself. I did an event last year where a woman said to me, I love what you've shared and I love what you say, but you do not speak for my daughter. You are not my daughter. And I was polite to her because I'm paid to be. But in my head, I was screaming, funnily enough, I'm not like your daughter because I'm not your daughter. You know, I've never claimed to be a voice for the community. I share my experiences. And so for me, autistic identity is that moment. I think it begins in that moment when you give yourself permission to be who you already are. I think there is such colossal pressure from society to be everything but. The messages I got as a child in school certainly were, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could be more like the others?
Yeah.
And it was only when I sort of dismissed all of that and accepted who I already was and gave myself permission to be an autistic person that I then felt that I'd developed my autistic identity. I was looking through some old photographs recently from primary school, and somebody had written underneath, I'll never forget Dean Beadle. I thought, oh, isn't that nice? And you know when you only read something once and you go back and read it again and you realise you've missed the meaning. I read it again and it said, I'll never forget Dean Beadle. He was a bad boy. He bit me on the shoulder.
Oh,
which I don't remember. Clearly she does. Second comment, I remember Dean Beadle, he used to try and break my hand, and I thought this is becoming some kind of sort of therapy group for survivors of Dean Beadle. And so I'd read it and I laughed and I thought nothing of it. Went back to find that picture again, and there was a comment I'd missed. And the comment said, I went to secondary school, high school with Dean Beadle, and he's changed big time. He's a good boy now. And that really upset me because the assumption there is that once I wasn't good. Yeah. You know, and you realise how much of people's identity is skewed by this sort of behaviourist approach that is often there. I was defined by behaviour, and people overlooked that that behaviour was as a result of a need. You know, I always think behaviour is a sign of anxiety or distress. It isn't aggression or anger. It's the sign the child's struggling. And so I realised a lot of my identity was about reclaiming how I saw myself, away from that negative narrative, I suppose.
It's so important, Dean. And I think this is why so many of my children end up with trauma, and no wonder they don't want to go to school and highly anxious, because how could that end up be written about you in words? People must have seen people wrote that down about you, or children felt it was okay to write that. That, I mean, it breaks my heart, but at the same time, it's such a good lesson for my listeners to hear you sharing that, because sometimes it's words my kids hear. It's not always written down, and they just hear those things from people. And I always say, you know, often two teachers will be talking about a child in front of them. Oh, he's having a bad day, in front of the child. Like, that's terrible. I
did a job in Scotland. I did a little tour of Scotland about a year ago, and had a lovely time, met a lot of wonderful people. Very, very appreciative that I'd made the journey up as well. But there was one lady I met who came up to me, and she's with her daughter, and she said, my daughter got her diagnosis 2 years ago, Dean, and she won't be as successful as you. It's crushed her. Look, it's completely taken away her self-esteem. And the girl was stood there, and I was watching her and thinking, it isn't the diagnosis that's crushed your self-esteem. It's hearing all this negativity. The mum even said, you know, in front of her daughter, I knew there was something wrong with her, Dean. And I looked at the little girl and I said, I want you to know now there is lots that's very right about you. Thank you very much. And people don't realise that the negative narrative that they're pumping out, that their children are hearing. And what strikes me, I was looking through some old paperwork from those days, from my childhood, which, listener, is some time ago now. I was looking through all this paperwork and was amazed that how negative, even staff that liked me seemingly, how negative the narrative was that they were writing. And thinking, you're writing about a child. How could anybody be as negative as this about a child? I did a job in a school, and a friend of mine who's the autism lead in this school said to me, "Can you look at this report about this child?" Because in this school they have quick written profiles of each child on the wall for new staff to see if they've got a change of staff. And a TA had written this this report of this child, and it said child X is always urinating in the corridor. Child X urinates in cupboards. Child X urinates in the playground. Child X urinates in the staff room. Child X gets violent if he can't urinate. Child X will manipulate situations so he can urinate, and on it went. And the autism lead passed it to me, completely, exasperated, and said, "Look at this, Dean. I'm staring at this, and it's making me so angry because that isn't the child I know. Would you rewrite it for us?" And I said, "Well, I've never met the child, but I'll do my best." And I sat staring at this paragraph, thinking, you can't improve this. And so the only thing I could think to do was to completely wipe the lot and just say, it is important to child X that they urinate regularly.
Perfect.
What they'd done is they'd focused on what they were seeing and not why it was happening. And there's a lot of behaviourism coming back up again in the UK. I don't know about Australia, but there's lots of what they call warm, strict and zero tolerance and all this stuff in schools, which basically gives schools carte blanche to not meet needs at all, or to not go into not be interested in looking at what the needs might be. For me, it's about looking at what the need is and then adapting the environment. And what we're seeing in a lot of these behaviourist practices is looking at what the need is and then trying to adapt and modify the child. And I think that leads to the trauma that you were talking about, because it teaches kids that the way they are isn't valid and that their right to say no isn't valid. And I think that's incredibly dangerous.
It's so dangerous. Gosh, Dean, you've covered a lot of things there, but I'm just thinking, I've just done a podcast with Jed Baker, who's a psychologist, and I'm sad to hear the behaviouralist stuff's coming up in the UK, because what Jed Baker said that I've never thought of before, all those behaviouralist models, which I learned at uni as well, are all based on animal studies.
Yeah.
And I mean, how wrong is that? They're not based on human studies. They're based on dogs and monkeys and, Pavlov's dogs. And how can we apply that to humans? That's just terrible.
Also,
and
when you look at the beginnings of some of those behaviourist approaches, and you read about how autistic people were referred to, I mean, in some of the research were referred to as subhuman.
Yeah.
You may be able to domesticate them with time.
Yeah.
How can anybody in 2020 be basing anything on that stuff that's clearly just beyond disgusting? And yet from somewhere this sort of behaviourist approach is coming back up. And it's probably because it's easier to punish behaviour than it is, and to traumatise someone into complying, than it is to try and understand why the person's distressed in the first place. And that's probably because it involves the professional accepting that maybe they've got something wrong somewhere along the line in understanding or supporting that child. It's easier to put it all on the kid, isn't it?
It so is, Dean. And that's why I love when we've spoken together, when you talk about giving the kids the tools and empowering them to manage their own behaviour. Instead, like when you were younger and you felt you were just given cards and being told you're naughty, but didn't know how you could be part of the solution, which is always what I think your message about helping the child feel like they're part of the solution is. And they do.
The sentence I always use with teachers is, I say, if you point a finger at any behaviour, you have to remember that 4 of your fingers are coming back your way.
Oh.
There are 4 things you could have done differently. And that isn't saying behaviour is anybody's fault. It's to say that we all have an impact on each other all the time. And I think too often everything is put on the child. And what's missed is people realising that actually maybe they raised their voice and that distressed the child. Maybe the sensory environment wasn't right. Maybe the child's anxious about all sorts of possible outcomes. We all have a part to play, and there are all things we could do that stop situations escalating. So I think a huge part of being part of the solution is being supported in working out what the need is in the first place. And I think very often that gets ignored. Schools are very good at having behaviour policies, but whether enough time is spent on looking at why the child's in distress in the first place. I'm not sure that's happening even still, enough anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I see some great examples, but I always think as a teacher with your four fingers pointing back, it's so much easier to be proactive than reactive. Actually, being reactive is exhausting, but putting in place positive strategies and building, maybe giving a child a job to build their self-esteem or distract them or whatever's required, isn't that better than sending them to sit in a corner? Like, there's so many things you can do that actually give the child the break in a positive way rather than them. And half the time, I think most of my students have no idea they're in trouble, because most of the kids that I work with don't like getting in trouble. So they'd never do it if there wasn't a reason for that to happen.
And it's true. And I think if you were to ask most people in the street, what is autism? I think a huge number of them would use the word behaviour in their description. Yeah. And it's always important to say that autism has never been and will never be considered a behavioural thing. There are no such thing as autistic behaviours. I do the same things under distress as I'm sure you do. It's just that we know that our autistic folk have probably got much higher anxiety baseline than non-autistic people do. The behaviour is not the definitive thing. I was doing an event in Hertfordshire, just north of London, and this little girl, she was 9 years old. She'd got her autism diagnosis 2 weeks before. And I was the first speaker that she'd ever heard talking about autism. And the first question that anybody asked in the room was hers, and her hand shot up. And she said, "Am I more likely to be a criminal when I grow up because I'm autistic?"
Stop.
I think it was only a year or two ago. So these are still the messages that are coming through. Autistic people are only reading in the paper about negative behaviour approach, negative stuff. And I had great pleasure in saying to that girl that time and time again, the statistics show that autistic people are much more likely to either be victims of crime or witnesses of crime than perpetrators of it. Autistic people are far more likely to want to adhere to the rules than to deliberately break them. The numbers just aren't there. And yet the newspapers only tend to report the one time a year that an autistic person finds their way into the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
And by one time a year, I mean in total, not each.
Yeah.
But they'll report on that, and the only thing that the child is seeing is that negative headline, and it proved it on that evening. That poor girl, her only understanding of what her identity was about behaviour. Totally missed the point. And it's that narrative around autism. We think things are changing, but still in the UK, I don't know about Australia. Anytime there's any kind of unusual crime, within minutes the newspapers are saying, "But could they have been?"
Yeah.
It's not helpful, and it's not accurate either.
No, it's not helpful or accurate. Yeah, no, I mean, we get mixed things in Australia. I get more upset where someone commits a crime and then they sort of backwards diagnose the person. Do you know, like, I don't like that, where they then sort of go and get a diagnosis and then sort of use autism as a blame, and that isn't what it should be at all. But I guess that's a whole nother thing. What age did you find out you're on the spectrum, Dean?
I was, it was 1998, so I'd have been 9. And people often say to me, where did you find out? Did your mother tell you on the top of a mountain with the wind blowing in your hair? Or did you go on a nice long train ride and she broke the news? No, her friends told me accidentally in Burger King. That's the tone of glamour in my life has started there and dropped. And her friend told me accidentally. Her friend thought I knew, and so she just mentioned it. And I'd been for the assessment probably about 3 to 6 months before. And Mum had got the outcome, she'd got the paperwork, but wasn't quite sure how to broach the subject, as so many parents. The $1 million question I get asked all the time is, how do I tell my child? So Mum wasn't sure how to tell me, and so her friend told me by accident, and so I found out at 9. But again, my only understanding of myself at that point, it took me much longer to build a sense of self. My only understanding at that time was, this must be the reason why I've been in trouble so much.
Oh.
That's how I internalized it. And I think a lot of kids do. I think that because of that sort of very behavior approach that we're still in, I think that's how to begin with, a lot of our young people end up defining themselves, and it's a shame. I hadn't realised that it had done any damage. That sort of negative narrative that was around me from professionals and in school, until I met my partner, and he said, "I love you," and I just didn't believe him. And it took a good couple of years to believe that it could be the truth. And I realised that my self-esteem had started to be built in amongst all of that criticism.
Wow.
So many of our autistic youngsters feel a pressure to mask, to conceal that they're autistic, pretend to be non-autistic. If the message that's coming across to our youngsters is you'll be successful if you pretend to not be you, that's really worrying. And dangerous. And so many autistic folk find themselves in burnout because of that, because they've spent their life acting, pretending to be somebody else, pretending to not be anxious. So my understanding of myself to begin with was very entrenched in that behaviorism, because it's what I was hearing. And then it probably took me another 10 years at least, I'd say, to reframe that narrative and see myself in a positive way. But parents often say to me, how do I tell my child that they're autistic? And I say to them, there isn't, the correct day, the correct age. What is important is how you frame it. So I think it's important here to talk about that there are different models of disability. So you've got the medical model, and that's where a diagnosis comes from. And the medical model is very much talking about disorder and deficit and things they've perceived the child is lacking. The social and it puts the medical model puts the focus on there being something deficit in the child. So if we work really hard to change the child, maybe the child will learn to be like his or her peers. And then you've got the social model of disability that says the individual is unique, is wonderful, has their own skills and talents. The problem is that the world isn't very well designed for them. So we change the world. If a child needs a wheelchair, we put a ramp in. We need to do that for our autistic folks. We don't try and teach the person in the wheelchair not to need a wheelchair. We modify the environment. So the social model says it isn't the person that's the problem. It's the fact that the environment doesn't meet the needs that is the disabling factor. And I go with that. So I think for parents, it's about saying to our children, you're fabulous as you are. The world doesn't understand you as well as they could. So that's what we need to work on. We need to educate people. We need to change the environment. These are the things that you find difficult because the world isn't very well designed for you. But these are the strengths that you have because you're autistic and not despite it. It has to be that positive message from the beginning. It isn't dismissing what the needs are. It's just not writing the child off because of them. It's the crucial point.
I agree. And I do think that's a bit of a challenge, because with some of my students that, as you say, with the behavioural model, often too, parents are sort of taking the children to a psychologist for there's a problem. Like the child senses they're there for a problem, not to understand and get insights. And I always say, you're going there, so I know how to teach you best. That's what I say to my students. I say, I've taught lots of children and I want you to have the best time in my classroom. And what I need to know is how I can make learning perfect for you and best for you, and so we can work together. And that's what I say to my parents. But the reason I don't want to label kids, but it tells me, well, this student really struggles with executive functioning, another might have massive sensory issues. So how do I accommodate those in that social construct? But that's all this evaluation's doing for me. And I sort of half read that and then observe and what I know best of the child. And I think for many of my families, I think they in their gut know that they should be going the way you're saying. But again, they get all this pressure from their, in-laws or other people going, what's your child's problem? So they start to hear that problem, even though their gut says their child is just different, not a problem. Yeah.
Well, I mentioned at the beginning about, you asked me what my favourite song to do was, and I said I haven't put it up yet. I've written a song, and as we speak, as we record, it's currently May. I've written the lyrics and I've written the top line melody. I've sent it across to my guy that does accompaniments for me, and he's putting the music around it. So hopefully within the next couple of weeks that'll be out on all my social media and YouTube and things. But what surprised me when I started to write, because that was my goal for this year, was to write some songs that I could perform, was what was coming out of me was all of this anger.
Wow.
And the song that's going to be coming out in a couple of weeks, hopefully, that the main point of it is it's saying to the non-autistic community, how dare you have the arrogance to think that you're the gold standard?
Yeah.
How dare you tell me that I'm less because I'm not you?
Yeah.
And when it doesn't take long to look at that attitude and think, actually, that's really disgusting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's that medical model saying 90% of people have got it right. You autistics need to work harder at being like us. And the social model says, actually, you've got a right to be yourself. And so the song I've written is all about that. Some research came out last year that I think is really interesting. It was by the Department of Autism Research and Technology at Edinburgh University. I had to Google that especially for you.
Oh, thank you, Dean. You always look after me, darling.
Because I talk about this research all the time, but I never know where it's come from, so I had to look it up for you. And they observed groups of autistic people interacting and groups of non-autistic people interacting, and then they watched them interact with each other. And what they found was that the non-autistics were very good at interacting with non-autistics. The autistics were excellent at interacting with autistics. The problem was when the two groups tried to interact. And so the outcome of the research wasn't that autistic people are socially deficit. It was that autistic people have a separate set of social skills that just happen to be different to non-autistic ones. And that bears out a theory that an autistic academic, easy to say, called Damien Milton has been writing about for the last 5 years, and he calls it the double empathy problem. And he says, you must remember, if you're non-autistic, that if you're struggling to understand autistic people, you have to remember all of the time that they are having just the same problem making sense of you. You know, the narrative for so long has been, aren't autistics hard to understand? But what the world's forgotten is that at the same time, autistics are sitting there thinking, what on earth are they meaning? Why on earth are they doing that? So it's just a case of two different kinds of brain trying to make sense of each other.
Yeah.
It's leveling that playing field. For too long, the blame has been apportioned on autistic people struggle to understand us.
Yeah.
Actually, both ways.
Love it.
You're struggling with us too. And it's finding that gap in the middle. And what was lovely about that research, and it's something nice we can tell our kids, is you're not lacking. You just have different abilities and skills than non-autistic people do. That's it.
Exactly. And I love the term diffability, not disability. And, it is just a different way of thinking and engaging and learning. And if we can just understand that difference. But I know, I have 3 so-called neurotypical kids. My 3 kids are all very different in their learning style too. And I think, we're all different learners. But just back on your goal, Dean, of writing a song this year, one of the things I've always loved about you, you always set yourself goals. When I first met you, you'd first started your singing lessons, remember?
Yeah.
And then you did your big weight loss and, and now writing a song. Do you spend a lot of time thinking I should set a goal, or do they sort of come to you? Like, you always seem, I love for parents listening, they often have trouble motivating their kids. Where does your motivation come from?
Funnily enough, this ticks in with what we've been talking about identity as well. Is I found that there are some days where I have all this energy to do things. I can get through the processes to do stuff. I can do the whole executive functioning thing just about. I can get myself in the bath. I can get myself out. I can get through my to-do list. And then there are big chunks of the week where I just can't. And I've had to realise that during the periods where I can't, to remember that those days where I can are coming.
Yeah.
And also to give myself permission to have those days where I can't. There are some days where I'm laying there thinking, processing the steps that need to be taken to get into the bath, and laying there for hours thinking it through and just thinking it's too many mountains to climb. I can't do that today. And realizing that is okay. I'll do it on a day when I can do it. And giving myself, realizing that I have that spiky profile, that there are days where I can do things and there are days when I can't. So the inspiration takes hold. It often comes from nowhere. I'll record something, I'll write something, I'll do whatever. And then I know that there'll be days coming in the rest of the week where I just won't be able to. I've had to learn to forgive myself for that. I used to put so much pressure on myself. You should be doing this. You should be out doing that. You should be maximizing every minute. Not realizing that I needed those moments of recovery in order to do the other stuff.
Yeah. And having traveled with you, I know you just get talked out and needed downtime where you just needed Dean time, and I need my time too. But I know, just getting up and presenting, that takes a huge amount of energy for you, Dean. And then, when we'd be traveling for quite a while where you'd just need that downtime. But I think I'm hoping more and more people working from home, actually some of my young people are going to have more work options where they can do 40 hours across a week that works for them, not have to go in the standard hours of everyone else.
Yeah, and this is the big change that I'm hoping for in the UK as well, is that for so long, people of all kinds of disabilities, and we're reclaiming the word disability because for so long it's been seen as a negative word. And people are saying, why isn't it? Why should it be a negative word? If we're going by the social model of disability, it's not criticism at all. It's just a word that describes that you're different, and that you have your needs. So there seems to be a really big movement to reclaim the word disability, which is interesting. But the employers for so long have said to disabled applicants, well, we love you, but we can't have you working for us because we need you to be in the office. And now they've fallen on their own sword, haven't they? Because now they're encouraging everyone to work from home. And so we're hoping that as a result of that, as you said, many, many more people who have been excluded from the workplace unfairly, employers won't have an excuse to do that anymore. And too right, because they're missing so much talent and ability that I think our workplaces need.
I couldn't agree.
Well, have a bit more empathy.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And, I think that I've always said the key is to put yourself in a child's shoes. Like, I've had friends who have gone into a Netflix void where they've just binged Netflix for days because they've lost their job or, can't put their head out from under the doona. Well, maybe a kid who's been at school all day goes into that Netflix void for exactly the same reasons, and hopefully people can reflect on those experiences they've had and how that anxiety shows up differently for everyone too.
Yeah. And realizing that I did a job recently where a teacher said to me, you're talking about anxiety and worrying about all possible outcomes. He said, what happens if you're anxious about something that's real? He said, what happens if you're anxious about something that's actually happening? And I said to him, I think you'll find that every single anxiety that our children feel is real.
Yeah.
It may not seem to be over anything rational to you, but if they're feeling it, it's real.
Yeah.
And I think maybe people will start to realise now the level of anxiety that their children, that they teach or that their parents of, experience every day over things that they don't notice. And I'm hoping, as I've said, that maybe this period of time will help people to realise that. And then hopefully see that they're not dealing with behaviour, they're dealing with distress.
Absolutely. And, I always say, if you can't get engagement and participation up until you get anxiety down. That's the number one thing, get the anxiety down, because as I know with you, that once your anxiety's down, your sense of humour, I always say once you get to know a person on the spectrum, you see their sense of humour. Well, when you're highly anxious, the jokes don't come out, right? But once you're relaxed, sometimes you use humour as a decoy, but for many of my kids, until you get the anxiety down, you don't get to see the beautiful person they are. Because how can they show that?
Yeah, I'll tell you this. I don't think I've told you this before. It's a story that involves you, actually.
Oh, did I make you anxious, Dean?
No, you didn't. But not in this instance. But you alluded to it earlier on, and it was something. It touched on what I said about permission to have your needs. Do you remember when we were in the hotel in Geelong?
Oh, yes.
And there was a spider in the corner of the room.
Your room.
And you came and dealt with it. You went all Indiana Jones about it. You're going around the room with a coat hanger, or Amazon-like in your sparkly top. And once you left the room, we'd swap rooms and stuff, and it was all sorted. Once you left the room, and I shut the door, and it was all resolved, I sat down and had a bit of a weep. And I thought, why am I
Oh,
upset? And it dawned on me that I was upset because somebody had seen my anxiety.
oh,
So
Dean.
I talk about it all the time and I
Yeah,
verbalize it in front of audiences all the time, but I don't actually let people see it.
so
I'd spent my
true.
entire life putting a mask in front of it, pretending I
Yeah.
wasn't overwhelmed. And someone had seen my anxiety. And in that moment, I felt that I was lessened by it. And I had to think,
Wow.
what does this mean? Why am I telling myself that I can talk about my needs publicly, but I can't actually have them and display them?
You're
And
making
I
me
realized again,
teary, Dean, because I didn't look on at you as being
no, of course you
anxious or
didn't. Of
needy. I
course,
didn't
it
even
was all
see
about
that.
me. It
Yeah.
wasn't you at all.
No.
It was how I was viewing that situation
Yeah.
and the shame I was feeling about it, and thinking, why are you thinking that? How can you advocate for other people to have their needs and then not give yourself permission to have your own? Why do you think of yourself as weaker because someone's seen it? And I
Yeah.
realized that it was quite a moment, actually. I realized that I still put that pressure on myself to conceal what my needs are, to not let people see them, to do
Wow.
them in private. Um, Another big thing that happened a few years after that, I was doing a conference in Ireland, and a friend of mine who I've worked with, a lovely woman called Emma Dalmain, who does a lot of work as an autistic advocate campaigning against all of the abuses that autistic people are
Mm.
subjected to. And she's wonderful. And she manages to get criminal convictions as well. She's great. We discovered at this conference in Ireland that we live really close to each other. And so she said, seeing as we live close to each other, we can share a cab home from the airport. So we did all the journey from Ireland back to southeast London together. And as she got out of the taxi, she said to me, "Now I know you live round the corner. We'll have to meet up for a curry." And I'd spent my entire life saying, "Yeah, that'll be great," knowing that even if I adore the person as I do her, knowing there was no way I'd be able to do that social commitment. You know, I socialise a handful of times a year, and that's enough. Um, Knowing I'd find a way out of it, knowing I'd have to come up with an excuse, and I felt this anxiety building. And I thought, I'm not going to say that anymore. I've had enough. And so I said to her, "That's a lovely offer, and I'd love to see you. But the reality is, chances are I won't have the energy on the given day, and chances are I'll be really flaky about it. So I won't commit if that's all right." And she looked back and she said, "Well, that makes perfect sense. That's fine."
Oh.
Because, of course, as a fellow autistic, she totally got it. And
Oh.
as she got out of the cab, I said to myself, I was 29 at the time, I said to myself, "You can say no, Dee.
Yeah.
You don't have to commit to stuff that you don't want to do. You have the right to say, that's a lovely idea, but I'm not going to do that because I haven't got the energy for it. That's not me."
Yeah.
But it took till 29 to be able to give
Wow.
myself permission, full permission, to say, that's lovely, but I don't think I want to do that at the moment. You know, and
Oh.
again, it's because society pressures you to keep up with everybody else, be more like the non-autistics. And a big bit of advice that I would give autistic people, parents of autistic people, teachers, is never encourage autistic people to feel like they're in a race or they're competing with non-autistics. You know, it's
Yeah.
comparing cats to dogs. We have different skills and abilities. And it's only when I stopped putting that pressure on myself to compete and do all the things my neurotypical friends could do. Who wins? I could force myself through all of that, but who wins? It's certainly not me. And I realized that I spent a lot of my 20s in burnout, where, you know, I'd do the tours. That we did 4 tours together. I'd do those. I'd be touring constantly in the UK as well, doing about 80 events a year. But when I wasn't doing that, I was laying flat in a dark room somewhere,
Yeah.
absolutely energyless, exhausted. And I hadn't realized at the time that that was what was happening. It was just what was happening. And it was only when about a year ago where I started to find I had this energy again, and this I was just getting through every day. You know, let's get this thing done. Let's get this thing done. Even things that I loved and enjoyed. Let's get it done. Let's get it done. And then about a year ago, I started to find myself really keen to do stuff again and energized. And I thought, oh, this is what it's supposed to be like. I realized that my 20s were a period of recovery from all of the anxiety and all of those years of concealing my needs, I suppose. So it's
Yeah.
only really been in the last year that I've said, actually, you're allowed to have your needs. You're allowed to say, actually, I need this accommodation, and that isn't a sign of weakness or falling behind non-autistic people. It's acknowledging that you are different to non-autistic people and that is your right.
I love it. And advocating for that. And it sounds like now you can self-advocate, which is what I say with my kids and to their parents. When the child knows about their diagnosis, they can actually advocate much more effectively. So one of my little boys, when he had a relief teacher one day, he could say to her, "Hi, I'm Adrian. I have Asperger's. I don't like having different teachers in the room, so I'm going to sit up the back and do my work." Isn't that better than him doing behavior, which is what he used to do, to get removed? So he was able to tell.
Remember, if that's effective,
yeah,
you discover in that moment when you're stressed and you react that people very often will take you out of the room.
Yeah,
that works. That's the quickest way to get out of that situation that I can't deal with. It would make sense why you would do that again.
Absolutely.
And people then start to talk about that as manipulative and challenging.
Oh,
it's not. It's a person in distress doing whatever it takes to get out of that difficult situation. And as you say, it can be sidestepped by just listening to what the child's needs are.
And letting them know they can communicate their needs, which I think is a good way to finish off, because I must say, typical us, Dean, we've gone well over the 30 minutes. But
there's one more thing.
Oh, yeah, go. That's what I was going to check. Yeah.
Because it sums up this whole thing entirely. I was doing a conference for school principals, head teachers, a couple of years ago. And a head teacher put her hand up and she said, if we live in a world of diversity and acceptance now, and I thought that's news to me, and she said, if we live in a world of diversity and acceptance, then why do you need a label, Dean? Surely we can meet your needs without you having this label. And I answered her. I found an answer, even though I was raging. I found an answer, and then I went home and wrote 1,000 words on it and popped it on social media as a proper response. I was so angry. And the response I came to was, I do not have a label. Label implies it's removable. Label implies it's been given to me. All a diagnosis is a professional opinion, a confirmation. I was autistic before I heard the word. It's who I am. I don't have a label. I have an identity. And so I meet a lot of parents who are nervous because they don't want to label their children. Yeah. We don't avoid finding out what your child's identity is. What we do is we avoid society thinking that that's a label.
Love it.
It's changing the narrative. And it's why the language is changing. We used to be told that you had to say person with autism. With implies that it's removable. It implies that I can leave it in the car. Autistic people again and again and again in research tell us that autistic is the word that we prefer. It's who we are. You wouldn't say man with gay.
Yeah.
You'd say gay man. And it's exactly the same principle. And all those medical terms like have autism, got autism. I met a parent the other day whose child was told they had patches of autism.
Oh.
Like under the arm and between the thighs. It's ridiculous. It's moving it away from it being this sort of, I suppose, medicalized problematic thing, and realizing it's a descriptor to describe how the person experiences life and what skills and abilities they have. It's shifting away from that medical model across to the social, and it's about changing that language as well.
I love it. And that's a great way to finish. And I will link to that, that I think so, it's on a blog somewhere. I remember I read it at the time.
About language?
About the label when you had that run-in with the head teacher.
Yeah, it's still online. It's still there. I'll tag you in it.
That would be great, because I'll put it in the show notes for people to read. So, Dean, absolute pleasure. I am sure people are going to take so much away from this, and stay safe. And thank you for joining us.
And you.
Well, I hope you've got some amazing insights and understanding and ready to embrace your child's autistic identity and help them embrace it too. I will make sure I put lots of great tips and ideas and link to some of Dean's amazing things in the podcast notes. So make sure you have a look at that. And I highly recommend that you find some autism mentors for your young people with autism spectrum. There's lots out online, and Dean Beadle would be one of the people that many of your kids would enjoy watching, and he's written some great poems, and I often put these things in my newsletter with his permission. So really keep an eye on people like Dean and Temple Grandin and Yen Perkins, and there's so many wonderful people with a lived experience who can give your child the mentoring that they need to embrace their autism identity. I hope you've got some great tips and strategies to make a difference. Remember, strategies wear out, and not every strategy works for everybody. If you're ready to dive in deeper to more strategies and ideas to make a difference, I'd highly recommend you consider Dr. Tony Atwood or my online courses. For more information, visit my website www.sulaki.com.au.